The Great Peru Divide is probably the pinnacle of the whole trip. And that was 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers of almost entirely off-road route through the Peruvian Andes. It's almost entirely above 3,500, 4,000 meters. The basic structure of your day is you do a 6-hour climb, one climb, all the way up to the top on off-road. And then you do about 2-3 hours down. And that can kind of be your day every day. If like that's going up to 5,000 meters over and up and then back down. I mean, there was a moment when I was doing the Great Peru Divide. I haven't actually felt this before, but it felt like it was my birthday every day. Like I was going to bed each night like a 7-year-old thinking like tomorrow is the big day, but that had been happening for weeks in a row. Like it was such a privilege to be in that circumstance.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hey amazing Seek Travel Ride community, it's Bella here, host and producer of the show, and I have a very special announcement to make. Seek Travel Ride is celebrating its first birthday. That's right, it's been 1 year since I first started recording guest interviews and releasing weekly episodes of the podcast. I could never have predicted what has transpired since then. Each week the show has grown, and with that a global community has been built around it. Listeners now in 122 countries and over 3,500 cities all around the world. People getting inspiration for their own future trips, reminiscing about trips they've taken in the past, as well as a whole lot of you who are tuning in while you were out there turning pedals mid-adventure. I didn't realise how big this show would get when I first pressed record, and it has been an absolute joy to bring these episodes to you each and every week. As an independent podcaster, I'm responsible for conducting the research on my guests, organising the schedule, compiling those interview questions, recording the show, editing the audio, and publishing each episode. My energy and passion to continue to produce Seek Travel Ride has only grown more over the course of this year, especially as I've come to realise just how important it has become to many of you. I've recently set up a Buy Me a Coffee page for those of you who want to contribute and be a part of this journey. It's a simple and direct way to support this independent podcaster out, and every contribution, big or small, means the world to me. I've included a link to Buy Me a Coffee in the show notes where you can find out more details about how you can get involved. Once again, thanks for being a vital part of Seek Travel Ride this past year. Your support and enthusiasm for this show helps keep my mic on, ideas flowing, and most importantly, this community thriving. So, cheers to 1 year of Seek Travel Ride. I'm excited for the journey ahead and another year filled with fantastic guests sharing their stories and bicycle adventure experiences. Now, let's get on to the show. Hello, I'm your host, Bella Malloy, and I'm excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Jack Greenwood. I'm speaking with Jack today, just days since he finished a tour of over 12,000 kilometres through South America, from Patagonia to Colombia. This trip was conceived by Jack many years ago while watching the film The Motorcycle Diaries, which covered the journey of Che Guevara and Alberto Granado. They, of course, were on motorbikes, but Jack instead wanted to recreate that trip on conventional bicycles instead. Now, some years passed since first thinking of this journey, but I suspect that has only served to sharpen Jack's mind with anticipation and curiosity with what was to come. Setting off from the Patagonian town of Chilichico near the border of Argentina, with an end destination of Cartagena, Colombia, with loads of adventure packed in between. I'm looking forward to speaking with Jack and having him share his experiences from this bicycle trip of a lifetime. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
First of all, congratulations. I always think it's quite something to be celebrated when you set a goal many years ago, stuck to it and seen it through.
Yeah, it's one of those ones which is hard to believe it's kind of real at the moment. I'm still in the immediate aftermaths. The processing is still taking place.
Absolutely, Jack. I suspect that processing may take months or even years to fully sink in. So enjoy the process. But Jack, a question which I start my show with, and I ask this of all of my guests, is, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
Don't think I could give a perfect description of that perfect bike. I mean, I remember that I was a little bit late to learning how to ride a bike. We used to live in the countryside, fairly small community. And I know the moment, can't really say I remember it perfectly myself, but I know that my mum said that I had been struggling to learn a bike or not quite managing to learn a bike. And then my best friend at the time rode past the end of my road with his dad, just on his way on a loop around the countryside. And I saw him do that. And then I was immediately like, got on the bike and was like, right, it's happening. And then did it. So I remember the story. I don't think I could tell you the colours or the style of the bike itself.
Well, do you remember, like, since then, did you have some little mini bicycle adventures with your friend? Like, did you both ride bikes together?
Yeah, we definitely would have done after that, around the village or around the country lanes a little bit. And then it became something that we did with my family. I think there was about a 6 or 7 mile loop around the lanes because we lived on a little T-junction in the middle of the countryside. So you would go right, and then if you kept going left all the way around those roads, you'd eventually come back to the T-junction here. So that was sort of just perfect for an afternoon ride or a Sunday afternoon sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so did you continue, like, have you always ridden bikes then? Like, I often find with guests there's two types. There's ones that rode bikes heaps as kids and then not really much at all and rediscovered it as an adult. And there's ones who've sort of continued riding bikes just throughout. Which category do you fall into?
I wouldn't say I've always been constantly riding bikes, but as I said, living in the countryside, it was early on a way of going to meet friends. So friends would often live within, I don't know, 40 minutes to an hour and a half or something of riding a bike. Sometimes I'd ride down to my job. I used to work as a tennis coach, and we used to ride down to the nearest town to work there. And then, yeah, I've always ridden bikes, but probably the time when I started doing it a lot was when I went to university and I lived in London. It was a half-hour ride to and from university. So I got a really old bike from like my great uncle, I think, at that point, which was like a 1960s Peugeot, which I thought was a car make rather than a bike make. That shows you how old it was. That was a proper old-fashioned bike. Pretty cool thing to have at university, like bright orange, very retro looking. So I used to ride across London in that. And then it was pretty decrepit. I think it kind of fell apart after about 1 year. So then I got a little single-speed bike for university as well. And then I only got into doing long-distance riding post-university, a few years post-university, actually mid-20s, yeah.
Your background really, and I guess you talked there about being a tennis coach, but I guess your other sort of passion for sort of outdoor sports is more running and long-distance running, isn't it?
Yeah, running has been, I did a few runs when I was younger, about only a few 10Ks or something, but the running became what I sort of based my life around when I became a teacher from age of 23 or 24. Probably well known that teaching can be quite a stressful job, quite long hours. And when I first became a teacher back in England, the school year starts in September and I was going through until about November, totally overwhelmed because I've always done a lot of sport in my life, but I kind of left it completely to the side. All the way up until November, I was just dedicating all of my time to that and I was working a lot of hours and then taking all that stuff home. So I remember a moment very clearly in November when I had finally gone out to go for a run and it was raining, it was freezing cold. I got a stitch and there was almost tears of joy as I got the feeling of the stitch. It was the physical pain of the body, not a serious pain, but like that feeling of feeling something to do with moving your body was so significant at that moment, having been so in my head for those few months. And then didn't really look back after that with running. I became a little bit addicted.
I sort of know that sensation, having lost something and rediscovered it again. And the only thing I can describe that to, and it is with riding bikes and being away from my bike for a while. And it's funny, you can dedicate so much time to cycling and it doesn't take much time for the fitness that you build up to sort of seem to just dilute away and dissipate. And that first ride back can hurt. But to me, that equivalent feeling you described there of feeling a stitch and being joyful at that was I used to in Australia. I lived in the snowy mountains. We had a really steep hill climb straight out from home. And it was that feeling of that metallic taste in your mouth. I don't know if you've had that before, but you know, when you go really hard, really deep, it's like you're full on effort. It's almost like this metallic taste. which is obviously a sign that I wasn't as fit as I was when I last did that climb, but I was sort of happy to be back doing it. I think that's what you're trying to tell me there as well.
And if you think about that modern thing about mindfulness and being as present in the moment as possible, which generally means phasing out all over other distractions that are around you. I'm just thinking about that now. I don't think there is a moment where you can be less in the moment when you're going up a vertical incline and your entire body is screaming to try and make your way up there.
Yeah, I have to say, when I'm doing the same thing in the Pyrenees, generally I get sometimes I eyeball the roadside cows that are there up in the mountains. I often think that they're looking at me going, what on earth are you doing here? But they're always not too fast. But you're right. And there is something very mindful about that type of activity, whether it's trail running, whether it's cycling, whether it's hiking. I remember a good friend of mine who's a psychologist said there's a moment that when your heart gets up a certain heart rate, your mind actually can't think of anything else except the act of what it's doing. And so it's a great way to just clear your head and be in that moment, like you said.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that concept. Although you do, I guess one of the other great positives of doing long distance cycling and long distance running is you do achieve a bit of a state where your mind calms a little bit, and you, especially when you're more used to it and you're accustomed to it, that your mind can wander a little bit. But yeah, that maximum effort, it's kind of impossible to engage in anything else other than what you're doing in that second.
Yeah, and I imagine like when we get into the details of your trip, a lot of your maximum efforts on this trip would have been at some serious elevation, where doing things which would not require maximum effort at sea level all of a sudden has your heart pinging. I could only imagine what those moments would have been like for you.
Yeah, definitely.
So, Jack, we've mentioned there that, your career there, it's a teacher. I said in my intro that the inspiration for this trip came to you when you first saw the film Motorcycle Diaries. A few years have passed in between. Was that something that you clung on to? Like, have you always had this dream of, I'm going to redo this trip, an homage to that trip, but on a bicycle, I'm going to go all the way up South America? Or has that sort of flitted in and out of you as your career's taken shape as well?
Yeah, well, just maybe to give a bit of context, I don't know if everybody's seen it. It's a pretty famous film now. I imagine these traveling people who'll be listening to this will probably have seen it. But there's a 2004 film about the early life of Che Guevara, who was he was an Argentine doctor he was about 23. He went off on a motorbike with his 29-year-old mate, and they left from Buenos Aires, went further south in South America to Chile, and then turned northwards and went all the way to Venezuela, I think, in the end. And I've taken a bit of criticism from certain people online about romanticizing the trip because Che Guevara had maybe a complicated life and did some difficult things later on in life. I've kind of pointed out that I'm really focusing on him as a 23-year-old when he was, had this ambition to travel and what that travel would give him. And he actually did, a couple of years before that, in 1951, he did a 4,000-kilometer trip through northern Argentina on a BC Moto, which is kind of like, from what I can work out, it's like a little bike which had a little motor that you could use the motor until it ran out of a little bit of petrol, and then he'd be pedaling. So he's actually done a similar trip in that way through Salta and through some of the provinces which we eventually went through. But yeah, I'd seen that film. That film was a big inspiration for me, I think, because it's quite heavily linked to history. And as he's going through these landscapes, he's thinking about the societies which have grown up and potentially the inequality that he sees in lots of these different countries, and what some of his ideas about seeing that the same problems exist in whatever communities he goes to. And it's generally a specific part of the population which is a bit marginalized. But there's some beautiful moments, for example, when he's writing, he's leaning on the wall in Machu Picchu, just in the middle of the mountains, just writing his ideas about what he's seeing in society. And yeah, if it's mixing adventure with history. And I'm a history nerd, after all. I'm a history teacher, and I've got to embrace that as a teacher to show that's the passion for my subject. So actually, I was always very keen on learning Spanish as well, because it seemed like a key to all of those countries. So after university, I went to live in Peru for a year, just working full-time as a teacher at an international school. And the idea was always to do about 6 months of that teaching in Peru and then somehow get a motorbike and follow that journey. But when I was there, after 6 months in Peru, I kind of realized that there was so much to see just in that one country that I decided to dedicate all of my time to just staying in that country and didn't do any extra traveling around that one. So just picking up all these different incredible places in Peru. And then I went back to England and kind of with the dream in the back of my mind that I'd work for however many years it took to be able to fund doing this long-term bike trip. In the end, it took 6.5 years to have enough money and for the context to be right to set out once more to try and do a longer cycle trip.
It's a lot of time to think about it too, though, if that makes sense, and a lot of time to, I guess there's two things for me, like living in South America, living in Peru, there's an idea of some of the culture that you're going to visit, but not all of it, because obviously that's going to change as you make your way up the continent as well. And it's not lost on me, especially as an Aussie moving to Europe and living in France. I don't have to go too far there for things. They're still French, but they're very different. Where I live in the Pyrenees, we're surrounded by a lot of the Qatar castles, and the history from the wars and the Crusades and stuff is all around me. And it's quite stark there. Then when I'm in the Pays Basque, it's very, very different again. And I imagine that you would have had that colliding on this South American trip, but with your passion for history and as a teacher as well, building up to a goal over many years, I imagine, not daily, but momentarily throughout that time, you're probably sort of maybe thinking about this and thinking about areas you want to see and when you're going to see them and how you're going to do that on that trip as well. So there would be a lot of anticipation mixed with curiosity as well, I imagine.
Obviously, there's also the fun of having just how young people and students react to it, because obviously I'm passionate about working with young people, but once they knew about it, there was a lot of I used to get asked a lot of questions in the run-up to it, like, "Sir, when are you going on your little bike trip?" And I'll be like, "It's not a little bike trip. It's going to take me quite a long time, actually." But it's just it's quite a fascinating thing to be able to tell that to young people, because most of them had never conceived of something like that or wouldn't necessarily know it was possible. So some kids were fascinated by it and wanted to see the map and wanted me to show them across the map where I'd be going. And some of them couldn't care less, but that's the way it is in classrooms generally.
Oh, definitely. Can I ask just quickly, what sort of age group are you teaching history to?
They are 11 to 18.
No wonder those first few months were quite stressful.
Yeah, in the beginning.
Did you miss it? Did you miss teaching while you were away on this trip?
Well, actually, I did. Yeah, when I set off after a few months, I did realize there's something that you miss in your life. It's impossible to replicate having to go into a classroom and being responsible for 250 young people every week. That is not something you can do it's very difficult to do in any other walk of life. So when you're traveling basically alone or with one person in these vast, pretty quiet landscapes, you are pretty far away from the sense of being responsible for many people. But I'm quite an introverted person anyway, so I am comfortable with that. But certainly thinking back to teaching and thinking back to that different rhythm of life was something I look forward to. And I stopped for a month. I had a pretty unbelievable thing where after 4 months, I was kind of a bit tired of doing day-on-day cycling. And I wanted to stick around in one place and get to know it a little better. And that timed with my return to Peru after 6.5 years. And I asked a few people that I knew, and it turned out that I can't believe this worked out this way, but basically the weekend after I arrived there was an opportunity to work as an English teacher for 1 month because the English teacher had gone back to America. But I was like, I'm literally here for 1 month, so I'm happy to do that. So I ended up working in a primary school with some very young kids, which I hadn't done before, but it's a little bit different teaching English to 3-year-olds compared to teaching politics to 18-year-olds in the UK, but it was a lot of fun.
It almost sounds like a serendipitous moment, like it was unplanned but meant to be. It all slotted into place. It's worked out nicely for you there. But I think also possibly a month of re-energizing. I certainly know there's moments where I love riding my bike, but then there's moments later in the year where I'm sick of the thought of riding a bike, dare I say it.
Yeah.
I can appreciate that sort of touring fatigue, if that makes sense, to a lack of a better way to describe it there, of wanting to sort of just start a new routine, have a little break.
I was going to say it's like anything, and it's similar to maybe coming to the end of term in a teaching sense, that you can still be enjoying it, but it's quite difficult to process, that your mind just feels quite full. There's so many things that you see in 4 months of writing that you need to stay still so that you can just think about those things rather than keep filling your mind with new things. Like, it depends on the time you have as well. I had an open-ended trip, well, relatively open-ended. So yeah, my friend Jake, who I was traveling with, he only had 5 months. So you can definitely understand why you've been in a different mental space. He wanted to carry on, and he did his final months alone at that point. But given that I had this time stretching out, I was like, and also arriving to Cusco, which I think is probably for me maybe the most magical city in the world. The job was in the Sacred Valley, which is the Incas controlled 10 million people, maybe more, across 6 countries of the whole of South America, that most incredible continent. And of all that, they chose the Sacred Valley to set up their sort of ancient capital because they believed it was the navel of the universe, like the most special place in the universe. And that was literally where I got offered a job to teach English. So as a history teacher, I'm not sure it gets much better than that.
Yeah, I feel like you sort of reached history nirvana there in a way. It's going to be hard to top that location. But something else I was thinking there, I've had the pleasure and the joy on this show of interviewing a few guests, and I've interviewed a few now who have travelled through South America, most recently 2 guests, Katja and Martin, a Danish couple. And a topic that came up when we talked about there was, firstly, I pointed out that I feel like they travelled and experienced and saw every single type of natural feature or landmark that we could think of. Glaciers, high mountains, salt deserts, rainforests, jungles, lakes, rivers, beaches, cities, everything in between. But the other thing is, and obviously a big part of a trip like that is about taking in the natural beauty and the changes in the landscape that happen as you traverse an entire continent. But then there's the other side of it too, where there's obviously the cultural side and there's the side of obviously observations of people and way of life and things like that as well. And Katja sort of said it was really stark to her. You're very aware of your privilege on trips like this. You see it so starkly. What you're doing is something that you're able to do where you're passing people all the time who were possibly never able to really leave the confines of a certain area around their village. The ideas of even owning a bike would be not open to them. Did that hit you much during this trip as well? I'm not saying necessarily in the same context. You sound like someone who's sort of has a presence of mind to be aware of this. I don't think it's something that, I don't think this would be a blind spot for you. But I'm interested to sort of hear your take on dealing with that side of cycle touring as well.
Yeah, I think it's something that's definitely worth being aware of. I mean, as I'm always describing it to people, you're sort of saying it is just a privilege every day. I mean, there was a moment when I was doing the Great Peru Divide when I was telling my mum that I haven't actually felt this before, but it felt like it was my birthday every day. Like I was going to bed each night like a 7-year-old thinking like tomorrow is the big day, but that had been happening for weeks in a row. Like it was such a privilege to be in that circumstance. And you also tend to think to yourself that you're doing the traveling in quite a cheap way, which you are doing it in quite a cheap way compared to what is on offer and what is commonly, marketed to people from the Western world. But even the little money that I'm spending, without having to work day to day is starkly different to what is available to lots of people working in, say, these mountain communities. And lots of people, I think, just working, particularly in Peru, for example, people are just working on subsistence farming. So, whatever they grow or whatever they, getting wool from alpacas or growing a small amount of food is the only resources that they have. So you're constantly reminded of the freedom that you have, and also, just things like having a passport and being able to travel freely between these countries. And you get some interesting questions from people along the way, and you have conversations when it's really clear that people, they say like, did you cycle here to Ecuador from England by bike? And I'll be like, well, it's quite a big ocean in the way of doing that. But you're talking to people who have a very different conception of the world, or potentially haven't had education in the same way. So it's your difference is quite obvious, I'd say.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like I said, when I was speaking with both Katja and Martin also obviously felt, what you've talked about, you feel your privilege there as well, as Katja had described it. And he said he always took it as his opportunity to teach people about him and teach them about Denmark and talk to them about their traditions and stuff as well. So, it's sort of a learning opportunity whilst taking in all the learnings of the kind strangers and other people that they've met along the way there as well. I imagine being a teacher and a passionate one, at least that comes across with what you've discussed here, perhaps it's just in your mannerism to share teachings and to share learnings anyway, Jack.
Yeah, it's really nice to have those sorts of conversations. And then you definitely get a lot of people who, I don't know if you've talked about the iOverlander app, which is quite a popular app amongst people who travel in this way. But people put little spots on the map which you can go to where people have said, sometimes just for free, they're like, yeah, you can camp on our property, it's here. So those sort of people maybe a bit more used to people traveling through, and they've basically advertised their spot because they've met some cycle tourers or some people touring in motorhomes before, and they're like, that was actually quite fun having that evening just to chat away. It's a great opportunity to share these sorts of things. But yeah, meeting people all the way through is part of it. I mean, imagining there are some incredible moments when you're going for maybe days without shops and without many signs of human life, but realistically, meeting people and understanding how they've learned to adapt in those communities is a huge part of understanding better that culture. So if you're not sharing and discussing things with them, then there's a layer of understanding that you're missing about what it's like to exist in those spaces.
Yeah, and I guess you get a sort of an appreciation of their existence by, there'd be many times where you're travelling has not been an easy day of effort as well. And whilst what you're doing and what others have done is through choice, and it's the way you wish to see the place and to learn things, as you say, there's people toiling, literally, hard work, hard graft, not by choice, and that's just their daily life. So there's possibly a level of empathy that you can get from travelling in this manner by feeling the landscape as well, perhaps.
I think, as you said, that when people ask you, is it hard? They're like, well, it's not hard. To do this trip is something I've always dreamed of doing, and it's a total privilege to be able to do it. I did make a jump and I did leave a few things behind, and I think that maybe it's quite tricky for people to realize that a lot of people could do it. And the money that I spent is not a huge amount of money in terms of what people are paid in my country or in similar Western countries. So it's definitely achievable for more people than do it. But it's not hard in the sense that, it's basically a gift to myself. And I think it's a positive investment because I'll be able to, the person that makes me and the things that I can share, and essentially makes me quite a happy human being going forward, is a gift to me and will have a positive impact on others. But ultimately, it's just a privilege. But going through all those communities as well, and particularly the ones which have a lot in common with their ancestors, which haven't changed for a long time, is always a fascinating thing to learn about those older cultures. I think I was thinking in Australia, I was reading a book by Bill Bryson recently. He talks quite a bit about the indigenous Aborigines there. I think modernization gets rid of a lot of the ancient teachings of indigenous people, and the West has a way of finding these magical cures and being like, oh, we can actually do this, which we've forgotten for years. And the indigenous people are like, yeah, we've been doing that the whole time, and you just haven't listened.
Certainly here in Australia, when we talk about our First Nations people here as well, there's also, they've been living off the land for so long. I know, Australia is a country known for severe bushfires, and a lot of learnings are finally being taken by the way that First Nations people have managed the land here as well, and, control burns and things like that as well. I certainly feel, and I hope that this does change, I feel there have been so many lost opportunities for decades now of not actually embedding a lot of that First Nations culture into our education system as well, growing up and teaching these great stories and learning more than, white settlers, if that makes sense as well. There's, I think, so many tens of thousands of years of experience here before white settlers in Australia. And I feel travelling through South America there and going through so many different Indigenous communities and that you would have seen along the way there as well. Oh, gosh, I keep thinking, Jack, as a history teacher, you were just in your element there. You must have best been in your flow for so many days as well.
Yeah, absolutely loving it. I'm trying to read sort of a historical book about every country and also a fiction one about every country as well to sort of really set your mind in that space because, people are influenced, the things they write are influenced by the communities that they live in and the countries that they've grown up in. So if you're imagining those things you go through, there's so many examples of that, but coming to Allende, who was the first democratically elected Marxist in Chile in 1971. There's a palace in the center of Santiago, and there was a coup there in 1973, and that was when Pinochet took power, and he flew over the palace and bombed the palace in the center of Santiago, in the middle of the city. And this was, this end of this great democratically elected president who was found with a shotgun in his hand on his desk in his office. I went to the museum and then just went and was like, where is that palace actually? And just found it was, 20-minute walk away. Just went and sat outside this palace and was watching this. It's what history teachers do, hopefully, if people are passionate about it. there was just example after example of doing things like that.
It still blows my mind. And look, I know I've mentioned it on previous episodes, and I even mentioned it earlier with our chat here, but it's not lost on me when I'm in France of seeing places like this as well, or throughout Europe, and seeing something and going, my goodness, what happens there? I've found when I've returned back to Australia, I know this might sound odd, but I often look at really large, big trees now, and I think, imagine the stories they could tell of what has happened on this trail. And maybe that's just the way I am connected to nature, and, you know, I live for the outdoors, I live for the environment. Yeah, like you said, reading a book, knowing some significant event happened and then being 20 minutes walk away from where that was, to be able to sit outside and actually just sit there with that thought. It's such a gift, really. I think that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah. Perhaps my nerdiest tendency is sat in Incan ruins in Peru and just like really trying hard just to see what it was like 500 years ago to this day, you know, before the Spanish arrived. Just wanting to see, like, can I just see it for 2 minutes, what it was like? It just would be really fascinated to see what it was like.
Yeah, travelling back in time as opposed to travelling forward and wondering what it'll be like in another 2,000 years if we get to that point. There is an element there as well, something that you focused in on, I think it was from about 2019, was with your travelling and your adventures, was finding adventure in small things, not needing to fly to places as well, to have those sort of that sense of travelling and learning and whatever we travel for. I guess there's a sustainability part to that as well, no doubt.
Yeah, well, I know people do take flight emissions very seriously. I think there's a bit of a balance you've got to get. I mean, some people would say, I am not going to fly anymore, full stop. The only thing with that, I think, is that the opportunity to travel and the importance of the fabric of society being made up of people who have been and experienced other cultures is so important in a very international world for us to be able to understand other cultures, right? So I think it would be a really bad thing if there was no more travel anymore. I think it has huge benefits for understanding and for, you know, communication across borders. So I think the idea is to find out a way of still doing it, but making sure that it's done in a sustainable way. I think particularly with flying, I think it's just important to us to do your flying in a way that just that you're asking yourself, how much impact does this have? How often am I going to do it? But I don't necessarily believe that we should ban everything in the same way that banning all, making sure everyone should be vegan is another thing which should be quite a hard line, quite extreme. But I think it would be good if everybody thought deeply about that. In my case, I knew I'd been to Peru and that was an incredible thing. But when I traveled to all these different places within Peru, I kind of was looking at the English map and being like, I live in quite a small country, but I haven't been there. And these are all places that people would come and visit from other countries. So my running and cycle adventuring started. I came back and was like, well, I had a 2-year contract. And I was like, at least for these 2 years, I'm going to stay entirely in England. And then the pandemic happened, so it made it quite a bit easier not to think about going long distances to places. But in the end, it was from 4 years without going on a plane. But in those 4 years, I had like 3 or 4 trips around England. I cycled around Scotland, the North Coast 500. I did cross Wales twice, 2 different ways. I got a ferry to France and cycled the whole of France, Spain and Lisbon, and then just got on 2 buses and a ferry back. So I would say I had the most significant adventures of my lifetime were probably in those 4 years. You realize that the adventure spirit is kind of something that you have to, it's a mindset that you get into, but you can have pretty incredible adventures just by traveling by your own 2 feet or 2 legs on a bike. It's not necessary to fly all over the world. But having said that, I was building towards using up my sort of flight credits, I guess, in a seriously big way. But there was so much more to be gained from leaving my job, doing a very long distance tour, and having that thing which would totally change my life forever, than doing shorter holidays in consistent years and using a lot of flights. Because those things, although fantastic holidays and great experiences, didn't tend to have the same impact as doing a 9-month trip.
I guess it's not to belittle the need for people to take a break.
Yeah.
Many people work months to take a short 4-day weekend island holiday somewhere, especially in Europe where short-haul flights and everything is so, how would I say, it's so available. That's not the word I'm looking for, but I think you know what I mean.
Well, they're so cheap as well, to be fair.
They are. They're ridiculously cheap. Like obscenely cheap is the way that I would view it. It's obscene.
Yeah.
As an Aussie, I'm used to the idea of having to travel on planes to go vast distances sometimes, like this.
Yeah.
But I must say also, as I think about the way our world's going and everything, I have it more in my mind about sustainable travel, about if I want to travel back to Australia to see family or go back to France, that's such a long haul flight. What am I doing? But I look at what I'm doing day to day. You know, I live without a car. I've chosen to do that of my own bat. I cycle, commute everywhere. I do still eat meat, but not often. You know, there's little things that I'm doing. Now, I know that getting on a long-haul flight to Australia where it takes a day to get there probably blows out a lot of my sustainability credits out there. But I've also chosen to sacrifice in other ways, and I think that's what you were talking to there as well. Can I ask, when you have that mindset, obviously then setting off on a 10-month rough journey, 9-10 months, you're obviously then seeing things through a different lens. Like growing up in a Western country, seeing how we talk, and if we take environment and sustainability as a topic here, how we tackle climate issues from a Western mind, going to a continent where opportunity, money, finances isn't available to necessarily tackle a lot of these issues. How has that been? Like what observations have you made from that perspective through South America?
As in, how do I view the communities?
From a sustainability point of view, what are the things that sort of stood out for you there? I imagine there would be instances where you're seeing things where you go, this is actually, you know, from farming practices to transportation to ways of life to perhaps even to polluted areas and things like that as well.
Well, yeah, I think the comparison with particular people you're coming across is really important for maybe inspiring you to make changes in your life. Traditional way of human living, some of these communities are living in the way that they've always lived, doesn't really have any impact on the environment, or not to an extent that it could possibly change the heating in the environment. But like that fact, when you're thinking about flying, that, oh, it'd be really nice to go on holiday this year. It would be, to be fair, but 80% of people have never been on a flight. Like we live in such an extreme, particularly in the West, in such a moment of, it is so easy to travel, but it's useful to remember how absurd that is compared to A, all of the humans that have ever existed, but B, everyone who is alive now. We are the actual tiny little
blip
at the top who still flies. 80% have never been on a flight. So I had a really lovely moment with a little boy at the side of the road. I had so many conversations with little kids because they obviously come up and ask you all sorts of questions, which is really nice. That's how I maintained my contact with young people, because we would basically adopt a new family of little kids every night for one night only. They would ask, like, where are you from? And there was this one little boy who was just like, what does it feel like to fly? And I was like, I hadn't really thought like that. But I was like, yeah, it's a pretty special feeling, actually. But he was the only one that asked specifically about that. But could very well be the case that he might never know what it's like to fly if he lives in a very isolated community. Or the modern world probably has a way of making sure that it will be possible for him to fly at some point. But it's very worth remembering that you are part of a very small group of people who does and has had the experience of flying. We're very few within that. Thinking about how certain communities have been changed by modernization and things like that. The Great Peru Divide is probably the pinnacle of the whole trip. And that was 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers of almost entirely off-road route through the Peruvian Andes. It's almost entirely above 3,500, 4,000 meters. The basic structure of your day is you do a 6-hour climb, one climb, all the way up to the top on off-road, and then you do about 2-3 hours down, and that can kind of be your day every day. Like that's going up to 5,000 meters over and up, and then back down. And those routes are all based on old mining routes. And the only traffic you really see up there is these big mining lorries going through, and these mountains just blown apart to do the mining there. And just thinking about that, what's going on there, a lot of those companies, in particular in Peru, is a lot of Canadian companies that take a lot of the wealth and resources, but lots of those countries are the most resource-rich places in the entire world. They have so many resources and so much which they could use to develop their countries, but a lot of it is kind of siphoned off and has been historically. So yeah, walking through that, you can imagine what the story of those continents will be going forward if we get to a more serious place in the climate.
There's also a real paradox there too, isn't there? And, you know, stripping it away, like your ability to access these parts of the Andes, you know, in the Peru Divide, the whole way that it's accessible is through these roads, which were created through mining resources. So
yeah, exactly.
there's a paradox there as well of enjoying those moments, being able to get out in the outdoors, seeing these vistas you couldn't imagine before, having these experiences. As you say, it was like your birthday every day.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, it's hard to reconcile that. And it's not necessarily something you need to reconcile either. I'm not saying you need to, but it's just an interesting sort of insight to take away from it as well. I've interviewed a few people who've taken time off work, a big portion of their life, to go away and do big journeys, because big journeys can't happen in the conventional 9 to 5, Monday to Friday world that we live in for obvious reasons. But I almost feel like what you've done on this trip is actually going to sustain a lot of, like it's going to inform the way that you teach and the things that you teach about potentially as well. I don't think it could not. Trips like these definitely change people. But when a history teacher takes a trip through South America with the passion that you bring to it, I can only imagine the benefits that the children in your classrooms for years to come are going to get from that as well.
I think that's part of the way of convincing other people to do it, because I would recommend that other people do it, but people be saying, oh, take enough time to go and travel and not work. I'm like, this is actually a career move for me. This is very much part of it will always be part of my CV. It'll always be a talking point at any job I ever apply to. It'll always be an example of how I engage with what I am passionate about. And also, I think I did it partially because one thing I wanted to do a lot more of was do writing. So I've always enjoyed writing, and doing that trip gave me the space to do lots of writing as well. So it was it's more than just going traveling. It is literally a very significant step in the person that I'm going to be.
For sure. And actually, while we're talking about writing, we should give a shout out to the writing that you have done during this trip. You do have a Substack there that people can go to and subscribe to and actually read your accounts of travel on this. Do you want to just shout out, if people want to discover that, what's the best way for them to find you there online?
So I've started using that platform called Substack. It's called 10,000 kilometers arriba in Latino America, or in anglicized 10,000 kilometers arriba in Latino America, if you type that into Substack. But if you type in Jack Greenwood Substack, it'll probably come up. And if you're someone who likes photos, I've put a few photos on Instagram under Hedgewood.
I will definitely provide links in the show notes for you all to check that out from Jack. And as someone who has read through those stories on the Substack, I can definitely recommend them. You have a real great way of writing. It certainly, when I was reading your diary or your journals, for lack of a better way of putting it there, Jack, it sort of took me right to the spot. It made me feel like I was there. Similar to this podcast, perhaps people listening are right here with us talking, but your writing certainly transported me to the scenes. So listeners, I can definitely recommend that you check it out. I certainly read it, Jack, thinking, I really hope that you're going to maybe look at writing a book about this potentially. I know I have a few guests who have or are thinking about it. It's not for everyone, but I feel you've got a talent for it.
Very kind of you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking I would definitely like to write a book about it. I actually decided the final destination of the trip would be Cartagena, which was Gabriel Garcia Marquez's favorite city. He grew up in a town called Aracataca, I think it's called, on the Colombian coast in the Caribbean. And he was one of my favorite authors. So it was always sort of a pilgrimage towards that spot where he spent a lot of his life, right on the Caribbean coast. That feels really far away from an autumnal Chile, Patagonia down at the bottom of the continent, thinking about that Caribbean sea. So that idea was sort of sustaining me all the way up.
Again, it's just the polar opposite landscape there, because when you talk about autumnal Patagonia, I must admit I'm thinking of beautiful, beautiful leafy autumn colours, an ice blue sort of glacial waters, if there's any, and huge mountain peaks, probably with snow on them, no doubt as well, to those sandy beach views at the end there. If we were to take a moment, actually, you had so many years to sort of plan and think about this route. You have your start point and your end point. What depth of planning did you go to? Did you actually have a route planned, or was it more milestones along the trip where you thought, I need to be here and I need to be here and we'll connect the dots however? Like, talk to me about how you devised your route for this trip.
Well, so Jake, who also loves a bit of a bike tour, and my friend, he had previously gone from Nairobi to Cape Town, down Africa, and we were, although I kind of assumed that everyone secretly wants to do a bike trip like this, but I had advertised that I've been doing it for years and never quite got anyone to like fully commit to the idea of doing it. But we had both agreed that we would do it around April of 2023, and we'd probably 3 or 4 years previously been like, roughly around that time we need to sort of wrap up our jobs. But we were going to do the Silk Roads, and that was going to be another history, as a history teacher, that would be fascinating to go and do the whole Silk Roads. And then we kind of changed when Putin invaded Ukraine, actually, because we're kind of like, that whole region looks like it could be a bit unstable, and if something happens with China and blah, blah, blah. So there was a moment, I was actually on my birthday, I remember them saying when we went out for a few drinks, and we were like, I think it's a good time for your birthday to decide that we're going to South America instead. And that had always been secretly the place that I wanted to do the most, so I was pretty happy with that. And we essentially, it was more of a question just about where to start, really, or where we could get to within the 5 months which Jake had. And we ended up settling on 5 months for 6 countries, which turned out to be an insanely overambitious time frame for what could actually be achieved. That was completely ridiculous.
Especially 6 South American countries. We're not talking we're not talking Central America, and we're certainly not talking Western or Eastern Europe either. Like,
I think from now, I think the average probably from the people that I've seen doing it, I'm talking about it, is probably like a year to do it at a fairly standard pace. It's probably a year to do South America and a year to do North America. I think that's what a lot of people tend to say, like roughly around that. So 5 months to do nearly all of it was kind of ridiculous. Jake did manage to do the whole of Peru as well, actually, in 5 months when I stayed back for a bit. So he did do most of Chile and Argentina, Bolivia and Peru. But Ecuador and Colombia is still a significant part of that, which is at the top. Our initial timings, this was quite a fun extra part of the trip, was Jake's girlfriend, my friend from 10 years ago from university. She was arriving to Santiago in Chile like 6 weeks after we started. So we were on this sort of route to get to Santiago in Chile 6 weeks later to do that lower part of Patagonia. And then the really fun part of it was she hired a van, big van that was graffitied with Daft Punk all the way across the side, very visible from miles and miles away. And for 6 weeks, she was with us and she was driving behind us in the van.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes behind, sometimes ahead. And we would sort of meet for lunch or meet for dinner. And that was a real extra sort of versatility to our traveling method. Because I'm not sure that happens much for traveling cyclists, but I know that maybe there's some people listening right now who are lugging, tens of kilos across these mountains in that 6 weeks. I'm slightly embarrassed to say, but we could chuck all our stuff in the van, just go as light as normal bikes, and then do some of these amazing routes, light as anything. And then we'd meet up in the evening, and I'd grab my tent out.
You'd be silly to not take that opportunity up. I like sort of self-flagellation for if you didn't need to. I could guarantee you, to my listeners who are lugging, world touring bicycle loads on their trips at the moment, first of all, I hope you're having an awesome time, but for sure, 100% of you would be exactly like Jack and putting the gear in the back of the van for sure. I've got to say, though, what was it like after 6 weeks? the load comes back on the bike. What was that like?
Yeah, and actually that was coinciding with us sort of entering into the Andes properly for the first time. So just straight after that, we went up the hill into Bolivia and we're just above 3,500 meters. And it was a whole lot more tricky. That was when the altitude really started to kick in. The first time we had quite a few moments where we were quite seriously affected by that altitude, because when you're going uphill with all that kit, we had sort of your mind slows down quite a bit. You get blurred vision. Your vision doesn't go black, but the edges of your vision, it becomes it's like when someone's breathing really heavily in a video game, when you get hit in a video game and your vision narrows down and it feels like your head is shaking a little bit. I had a few nights when I was camping, just lying down camping around 4,000 meters, and you have feels like you kind of got a stitch in your chest, or you got something blocking your windpipe just from lying down and not even doing anything other than being still. And I remember that night sort of going to sleep, just sort of shallowly breathing. And then by the time I woke up, I had adjusted the altitude initially going up into Bolivia, which I mean, thinking of the topography of South America, you're coming from, there are significant mountains down in the south, but in hindsight, they are nothing like when you arrive to the mid part and you go up higher. And actually, when I went up into the mountains around that time, it didn't come down for 6 months after that, including the 2 months I stayed in Peru, but you're going up for a seriously long time.
It's something that struck me, again, looking at others who've done trips like this. It's so obvious when you see the elevation profiles as well. Stuff is just, it's so different to what a high mountain pass is like, but to what you're traversing, even sleeping at 4,000 meters of elevation, like that's quite serious there as well.
Yeah.
Did you find having consecutive days up in that space at that level of elevation, consecutive days at altitude, did you find you do adjust? You said you adjusted overnight, but then is it a case that you go back down and then you have to adjust again every night? Or did you find that your body was acclimating to altitude, or was that just random?
It attacked at random. Yeah, it did attack at random, as in there were certain days when you'd feel incredibly strong and you would push up and you'd be doing really well. Then you could somehow regress. I'm not necessarily sure if there was something to do with, so Argentina was often around 0 to 1,000, then up into Chile was like 1,500 to 2,000, then Bolivia was 3 to 3.5, and then Peru was 3.5 to 4. So if you go up the continent, you are naturally actually getting higher and higher as you go, and that's definitely a good way of doing it. But particularly in those initial days when you're getting used to the really high, it can attack at quite different times. You sort of collapse. I remember the first serious day of elevation was when we went from Salta, which is a city in northern Argentina, and we go up to this place called Salinas Grandes, which was the first salt flat that we came across. It's all in Argentina. It took us like 3 days to go up there. I think it was probably like 4,500 meters of climbing over 3 days or something like that. And the last day it was 1,800 meters or 2,000 meters over 35K. And it was only up. There was a little bit of downhill. It was over 4 hours in the end, on tarmac, on nice roads as well. But it was literally only up. And it sounds absurd. I think particularly, Australia does have some mountains.
Not really. We've got some hills.
In England, I'm not sure what the longest uphill is. I think it might be one in Scotland and the North Coast. I think a fast person could be up there in maybe an hour and a bit. But the whole idea of cycling uphill for 4 to 6 hours is completely foreign. But that is quite common.
Even in the Pyrenees, I rode across the Pyrenees this summer from coast to coast, and there are some long climbs, but even with a touring load, it might be 3 hours, 3.5 before you have your next downhill. We're not climbing up to that level of elevation. It's incredible to sort of think about there as well. Did you find it actually, I've often wondered this, like I can understand that the physical toll that it can take on you can obviously be present, like you're aware of that. There would be a mental toll too, wouldn't there? Like do you find you fatigue more? Is there any confusion that goes in with it? I've not been to that level of elevation trying to do something physical. What's it like mentally?
I think the thing you have to be probably aware of is if you're traveling with someone, you're both at quite a weak point towards the end of the day. I've had particularly, obviously, this is kind of similar in any situation, isn't it? But if you're traveling with someone, you got to make some pretty big decisions about whether someone might be completely done in and not able to feel like they're not able to do any more cycling at all. And it's important communicating with your partner, which I think we did really well as a pair generally. But like towards the end of the day, it's more likely that you're going to struggle to find common ground, I guess. And I wouldn't necessarily say you're definitely not thinking clearly.
You're exhausted, I guess.
Fortunately, you don't have too much to think about. You just kind of have to make sure you got your pasta and tomato sauce for the night, day after day.
Yeah, it can get a bit monotonous.
Yeah, as long as you got that, you're going to survive. Apart from that, it's just about finding a place which isn't too windy.
So pasta and tomato sauce is your survival camp meal. That's your staple there.
Yeah.
I have to ask, listeners of the show will know I love talking about food on tours, especially ones that traverse through different countries. What was probably the highlight camp meal if you were thinking of something there? Or it can even be street vendor food. I'm happy for it all.
I mainly eat plant-based sort of stuff, so generally I would have a very insanely boring diet of pasta and tomato every night with some sort of vegetables and porridge every morning. And then on the Peru divide, it was just like bread and whatever I could find for lunch. I did try fish about 3 or 4 times during the 9 months. I think ceviche is probably the dish which is quite just exquisite. I went with an old friend from Peru, and he invited me to go to a restaurant on the coast in Huanchaco, and that's when I'd been up in the mountains for 6 months. Came down to his town on the Peruvian coast, and he was like, "This is the best ceviche in town." And we went there, and ceviche is like raw fish with a lot of chili, a lot of lemon.
It's heaven.
A lot of corn and yuca, which is like this. It's a form of potato, I think. Really delicious. And sitting down on the beach in the warmth and being basically kind of cold for 4 months. That was a real moment where it peaked. The tour peaked at that moment, and that was special. And I really like, although I don't tend to eat fish or animals, if you have it as sort of like a reward or a celebration, it can really be quite a special moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it's sort of food's something that we use to celebrate with as well. And you would have noticed this, no doubt, being welcomed in by strangers, I imagine, along the trip. People celebrate you with food. They give you food as well. And it's sort of like that shared cultural thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what the food necessarily is. It always hits me quite starkly. Not stark's not the right word, but it always gives me pause whenever I'm interviewing guests or where it's happened to me or whether I'm watching something, how people with not so much find a way to give everything they have and especially save the best food they could ever afford to welcome a total stranger.
Yeah.
Did you have moments like that as well?
We had some lovely moments like that, actually. I was so invited to have food quite a few times, particularly, I'm not sure why this was, but in Ecuador, I was traveling with a guy called Keke, who was a Brazilian cycle tourer, and he's been gone almost 2 years, coming up to his 2-year anniversary now, just going all the way around South America just by bike power.
Well done, Keke. Wow, that's awesome.
There's something about Keke's face which makes people want to give things to him and donate things to him. He seems to always be smiling. He's got a big beard. He looks like a long-term traveler. And I think potentially there's a little bit more about gringos in South America, like white Westerners who they're kind of assumed to have money, right? So when I was traveling with him, it was often him which would get given things on the road, which is quite nice. But several times when we were traveling with him, in Ecuador, we got handed money quite a lot, just like where are you going? Where are you off to? Here's $10. We were kind of trying to live on about $5 to $10 a day at that time. So being given $10 was quite an incredible thing. And we would always share it, whatever we got given. We got invited to food quite a few times as well. Everyone knows how nice it is to be bought food, but when you're traveling for 6 hours a day and someone says, I'm going to buy you a meal and you're trying to travel cheap, it really is, it's an out-of-body experience to be offered something like that. It's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, and I guess also, as you said, just going somewhere where you're buying food that's being made fresh for you there as well would be an experience that you look forward to, because it's not every day that would happen. I imagine you went a few days just with what you're carrying on your bike and pasta and tomato sauce.
So you line your panniers with biscuits and bread and pasta. I'm not going to suggest that if somebody wants to do this in the most remote areas that they are going to be fine dining at all, but it's worth it for the adventure.
What about potatoes? I think if I recall Katja and Martin's discussion, I think Bolivia seemed to be the place of potatoes. Am I recalling that correctly?
Fun fact for you from Peru, there are 4,000 types of potato in Peru.
There we go. Maybe it was Peru.
But I didn't actually, just from a practical standpoint, I think cooking potatoes takes longer than cooking spaghetti. So I was rationing my gas. You can cook spaghetti in about 4 or 5 minutes. So that was it's always on your mind to get it done quicker as well.
Canned pasta, to me, it's just, I love it.
Yeah.
It's every now and then, and my husband's the same, every now and then, and I don't know whether it's through an act of reminiscing, and I say that because I've had other guests bring it up before as well, where all of a sudden you just find yourself cooking something that you did on a trip just to take you back there. I don't know whether that's going to happen to you. Maybe 6 months' time, Jack, you'll be coming back from school and you're thinking, I'm just going to have some pasta and tomato sauce for dinner tonight, and you'll be right there on the Peru divide. Stare at a mountain on your screen and you're there.
And I have thought about taking my little camp stove out to a tiny garden and just firing up out there with a bit of pasta, and maybe sitting in the December dark, but we'll see.
Yeah, it's things like that. Claire White, who traversed through Australia, she got sick of the sight of tinned tuna and crackers, but found herself buying Rivita and tuna when she came back to the UK just because she needed to reminisce a bit. And in another element, Rebecca Wiedner, amazing athlete, unicyclist who cycled the European divide on a unicycle, obviously. But when she finished her trip, something that she did was she slept with her bedroom window open every night because she could at least feel the air, the outside air on her. And that was her reminder of what she'd done and been outside.
Oh, yeah.
It's funny how we yearn for these memories. It's like, you know how smells take you back to a place, and the smell of leaves for me always has a vivid memory of places and things. And I imagine the cool thing about taking big trips like that is it'll be random what sparks it for you. You may not even know it right now. Something will happen and it'll take you right back there. It might be that you're reading something in a history book and going, oh, I know that place. That'll be pretty cool, actually.
My mate Jake told me about that I would have this experience as well, which has already turned out to be true. But the flashbacks are I think, one of the best gifts to yourself from this trip. You get flashbacks about like arriving to like a tiny little village, and then you think for a minute, you're like, wow, I do remember exactly what that looked like, but I have been through more than 1,000 villages, and you just take the time to think about it. Think about it like it was that country, it was that time of year, and then sometimes you have to look up on the map what the actual name of it was. But there are so many little minuscule flashbacks you have that just come to you at random moments, and that's quite beautiful.
I came across that. It was actually listening to another podcast. I think it was a podcast about the transcontinental. It was, or maybe even the Trans-Pyrenees. It was like an ultra cycling race podcast that was on at the time. And it was interviewing one of the athletes that was taking part. I think it was an Irishman. And he had said the reason he loves these events is because he's in the moment for so many hours the whole time. He's so mindful that when it's finished, he can recall things so much clearer than he could in any sort of everyday life scenario from a normal week. And maybe that's what you're thinking about there. Maybe it's a sign of the mindfulness in that moment, what we were talking about earlier in the show.
Yeah, your total engagement with that, with what you're seeing with your eyes, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about milestones. I can't help but think of the stark differences in the landscapes you've experienced. We were talking about the mountains and the salt flats, but you obviously experienced the jungle as well.
Yeah, we started off in very mountainous country with white peaks and autumn leaves, and there was lots of purples on the mountains. And then Argentina is actually the country which had the most variation, which I just did not have in my head when people say the name of a country and you have certain associations with what it looks like. Argentina just had incredible variation. So like it was like that, what you would think of when you think of Canada down south, and then going north, it was just completely like sort of Utah or Namibia or something, just all red rock, boiling hot, just incredible geological formations. And then it had the Altiplano as well, which is like the high plateaus with salt flats and freezing cold, all those sorts of things. Yeah, so much variation between those countries.
Just sort of thinking as well, something that a few people have told me about their experience on the salt flats is like your sort of perspective. It's hard to sort of get that sort of visual field of perspective of things as well. That sort of seems to change. Things that you can see so far, far away, but they're still there for ages as a little blip on the horizon.
Our favourite thing about that was we just sort of set off across the salt flat. It basically took us 3 days to get across the salt flat. So you can see these mountains at the edge. There's like a few individual mountains, and it's very hard to tell how far away things are. But yeah, there's actually islands in the salt flat, which one of them has a little restaurant on it and stuff, and you can stay the night on the island. But we went sort of island hopping on the salt flats. We went to the place where you can get a bit of food, and then we took our food off to this other island, which is completely deserted and no one's there. And you cycle up out of the sea onto the shore of the island, and then you set up your campsite. And then we had taken a couple of beers from the restaurant. We climbed up to the little high point on the island and watched the sunset. You'd sort of like looking out over this completely white frozen seascape, which isn't a sea actually, but that was that's hard. I don't think there's anywhere like that in the world actually.
It just sounds like such a unique experience, and I think you've had so many of them. If I think about something else though, we were talking earlier about you had the van assistance for 6 weeks, and then that ended, and it hit you like a ton of bricks when you started having to climb up into the mountains loaded on a bike.
Yeah.
Conversely, what was it like setting off as a team of 2 with your friend Jake, and then all of a sudden waving goodbye after 4 months together on the road, and then getting back to getting going again, but doing it on your own? Because I feel your experience on this trip, you have your own experiences even as a team of 2, but when there's not another person there with you and it's a solo experience, I imagine that becomes different as well.
Yeah, I think we've known each other for a long time, but we didn't go to university together, but we know each other through friends groups. Jake was the best mate of one of my best mates from uni. So there's people that I had known for much longer. So there wasn't a risk, but we were setting off knowing from the beginning that this person could be someone that you knew more about than potentially anyone else by the end of this trip, which is quite a fascinating thing. And the things you shared on those 4 months are just unbelievable. And maybe it's a sign of experiences that are truly fundamentally changing, but it's going to be difficult to explain to anyone else some of those moments that you had. But because most of us, I think, would have done it on our own anyway if we didn't have support. But I'm so glad that for a significant part of it, there was somebody there just to share it with, because it's basically impossible to describe what certain things that we had. And we talked about how for the next 50 years, I don't think that's absurd to say we both lived to about 80. We can just be like, do you remember that one night? Or do you remember that one village or that one meal? You know, we had 4 whole months of these experiences, but like, do you remember Via Santa Lucia when we sat down to have that lunch and that woman said about that thing? And to have that connection with somebody is pretty special.
Yeah, do you remember that wild camping spot that we both had?
Yeah.
Remember that night where we absolutely froze? There'll be a few type 2 fun moments welded into those memories as well, no doubt.
No, I know exactly what, I know you were just saying that randomly, but that exact night was on the salt flats when it got to like -10 or -12, I think. I had 6 layers on my top half, trousers, 2 parts of socks, a buff, a hat, a second buff over my face, and a thermal blanket inside my sleeping bag. And my sleeping bag is -7. And I woke up at 2 and was too cold to sleep, and I stayed awake until morning. That was the cold night.
Oh, that sounds so grim. I've had some bike tourists tell me the way to deal with the cold is heating like a bottle, heating water, putting it into a bottle and having that on you as well. I don't know whether or not you did that or knew about that for this trip at all. Actually, if I think about it, it's Katja Martin, who also obviously went through South America, and Mackenzie Barney. She cycled around the world, but she spoke about doing that on the Peru Divide.
Yeah.
That was her top tip in terms of keeping warm in those cold extremes.
Did she have an actual hot water bottle, or was it like just a normal bottle just filled with water?
I'm not sure. I can find out for you and let you know. I suspect with Katja and Martin, I'm not sure they had a hot water bottle as opposed to like a bottle that they would then wrap with clothes and put on them.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good shout.
Look, it's something that I would never have thought of. And it's interesting, actually, a different sort of thing. Different sort of facilities, but a recent guest of the show, Agnieszka Beginska, lovely Polish lady, she travelled through Iceland and the Faroe Islands and spoke about the best piece of equipment that you need to take if you're touring there is a hairdryer to dry everything out. Again, it's all about warmth and keeping dry. What about heat? Did you have to deal with extremes of heat and temperature on the other end of the spectrum at all?
Yeah, definitely up to around 35. I mean, actually, the last part was one of the most humid parts coming through Colombia. I mean, just nearly all of these countries have so much variation in the landscapes they have. But in Ecuador, we were initially on the coast, which was really hot. Then we went up into the Andes one last time, which is quite fresh up there, up to like 3,500 or something. And then we dropped down the other side. As you're coming off the mountain, we found this beautiful campsite, just like the last ridgeline, looking out across the Amazon. And you know, the Amazon is thousands and thousands of square kilometers. I think it's like 3 or 4 times the size of the whole of Western Europe or something like that.
It's huge.
You're literally on the edge of this Andes mountain chain, which goes for 5,000 miles itself all the way down the continent. You're just looking at it, it's totally flat the whole way across. And we had quite a fresh breeze up there. And then that next morning, we just dropped down like into the soup of the heat of the Amazon. So there was some serious humidity down there. But then later in Colombia, the last day I was looking at it, and it said it was 32, but the thermal sensation was 39. So I think it felt more like...
Oh, it's disgusting.
And that sweat was just unbelievable. You're just dripping in sweat. And also at that time, I don't have one now, but I had a beard down to here and like a ton of massive mullet going on as well. So I actually that's actually one of the more difficult things, shaving all that off at the end, but it kind of felt like it had to be done. But yeah, I was hot.
You nearly have a name for your beard when it's like that.
Yeah.
I know this is going to sound silly because obviously you are you. It's not like you're a different person with or without it. But did you feel weird, like shedding your beard, like your travel beard?
That was by far the most difficult moment I've had since finishing it at all.
It would be.
Really, really hot.
I couldn't imagine it.
I genuinely didn't recognize the person I was.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's maybe a little bit of a cliche thing because I didn't recognize the person in it, but I mean, like literally, because I had, I don't clean shave anyway, so it had been like probably years since I had clean shaven, and yeah, it had grown out like right down to here. And I think my big issue with it was, although I looked a bit scruffy and a bit like I'd been living on the street, which I had been, I looked like I was a person who had quite a lot of stories to tell, and I shaved it all off, everything, and I looked like an 18-year-old, and I was like, that person had just been in an office for 9 months. Like nobody would know. I was used to being looked at as somebody who would be
weathered.
and now I could just go under the radar and no one would think twice about it. And be like, that was part of my identity.
Are you tempted to grow it back?
I've started the process already.
Oh, wow. I'm going to have to check back with you in a year and see where you're at.
Yeah.
You can get some wax for it and mold it.
In the process.
I can't imagine, Jack, what it's actually like to switch up routines as well, because for, so many months of your life, you're in the routine of bike touring to then all of a sudden to not be in that routine. What's that been like?
I think that is slightly different from traveling normally as well, because it is quite a unique thing. I think if you're either walking or cycling or doing some other form of slow travel, it has the same rhythm to working life in some ways, because it's something you wake up and you got to get through. Obviously, it's a privilege to be doing it, but it's you've got about 8 hours on the road and 5 6 days will be moving and you'll have breaks and stuff. But essentially, we would be doing 5 or 6 days a week off that generally, and then having a day off. So it has something of a similarity to a working week. So you're sort of progressing towards this goal. So it's similar to working on a very long-term project at work or something. And in 9 months, I find it easier to have some sort of routine rather than traveling in a way when you're sort of going, oh, that place sounds cool, I'm going to go over there, and moving between these different places if you have a long time, because I knew where I was going all the time and there was never any doubt that I was going to keep going unless I was injured or whatever. I was going to keep going until I got to that goal. So it's similar to having a very long-term goal and finishing that and then being like, wow, what do I do next? But for me, that is, I've only told half the story of my writing. So that's the next thing I don't always have to have something there ahead of me that I have to work for, but it's nice to have that sort of layer of it, which is retelling the story, and that's going to go on for a few more months at least.
Could 100% understand that for sure. I also wonder, you talk about you always knew where your endpoint was, you always knew where you were heading to, but was there moments of spontaneity mixed in along this trip? I'm imagining there's places that you're learning about everything wherever you're going here. I mean, I know notwithstanding you spent 6 months in Peru, so you would have gone back to a place where there was some sort of familiarity there. But notwithstanding that, I imagine the vast majority of places, whilst you could educate yourself about them before going there, you're experiencing them from the first time. So I imagine there's unexpected moments of, wow, I didn't know this was here, and learning about a place. Did you ever find there were places that you just went, I need to be here for longer, I can't just cycle through? Or conversely, places where you have had to go through and you're already yearning to go back?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the best sign of that was when you realize you have a particular look on your face, which I was actually talking to my mum about this, and because I was describing how I'd felt on a particular day doing this downhill from Colombia, and when your jaw drops open a little bit and you realize it has happened, but it's kind of like awe on your face. Your eyes are like totally wide and your jaw drops open. I don't think you can really get to that unless you're seeing something which is sort of genuinely amazing you. And that does happen quite a lot on a tour like this. But I was sort of genuinely thinking about whether I ever have that expression on my face in normal life. There aren't many things which would make me feel, which would be that surprising to me in normal life. Like you have amazing moments or people do things that are unexpected, but that sort of jaw-dropping awe, that is a pretty good sign that you're on a bike tour, basically.
Is there a place? I keep thinking of the Peru Divide just because you said it and outright at the start. It was somewhere where you felt like it was your birthday every day. Were you finding that you were in that state of jaw-dropping awe all the way through there? Or are there other places you're thinking about we haven't even talked about that had you there as well? I mean, of course there were, but you know what I mean.
The Atacama was pretty up there as just an unbelievable place as well, because it just looks exactly like what you would imagine Mars, the surface of Mars to be like, because there's nothing there, and you can do like roads which are sometimes roads are like it's like 80 kilometers a straight line. There is no deviation in the road. And as you're cycling, I mean, you must know about that from Australia, but there's sort of...
Yeah, we have the longest straight road in the world, apparently, but the 90-mile straight. But that would do my head in.
Yeah.
I remember once, this sounds so insignificant, I was doing some bikepacking in Ireland, and there was a stretch from Athlone, I think, to Mullingar, or Mullingar to Athlone. I think it was the other way around. I don't know. It was 30 kilometres, maybe even 40, of just dead straight, no deviation, no real gradient. it was just dead flat. My goodness, it did my head in. And it was an old rail trail, I think. And so the road was sort of deep set in places. So you couldn't sort of see even over the banks to look out onto varying landscape. I know people who love it, who are like, oh, the surface is amazing and it's so effortless. And I was there going, but the view doesn't change. It's like a treadmill.
Yeah.
One of my very early guests, Mark Gresser, when he was doing his world trip, he's from WA. Hey, Mark, if you're listening. And he set off from his driveway in Perth and he said the first 8,000 kilometres through WA on his trip, it's probably the most flattest part of the world. He did not see a single mountain range. There's not really many hills, and it was like a treadmill. But I imagine the Atacama, I just could not imagine dead straight roads for that long. What do you do when it's like that? How do you entertain yourself? What thoughts are coming into your mind on endless straight roads?
This is the clip for you. You listen to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, obviously. No, I have spent some time listening.
No way. No.
I do think podcasts are a pretty special addition to the modern traveller. You can sort of dip into something that you're very fascinated in, particularly, well, I really enjoy listening to ones which are about the country that you're in, or listening to an audiobook that's about the country. I listened to Colombiano, which is by Rusty Young, when I was going through Colombia, and that was all about the guerrilla fighting in FARC and resistance with the autodefensas, the government forces and things like that, and that really puts you in a good mindset for it. But that can help you to get through, particularly in the Atacama when the weather doesn't change at all either. There's never any variation in the weather. My favorite fact from the Calama, this time we went from the Atacama, is that it once went 401 years without raining in that town. 401 years. And we get quite upset in England if it doesn't rain, if it gets really hot for 3 days, about 72 hours.
Just imagine the length of the hosepipe bands.
I don't think water even exists within the province, but 401 years. I think it's from 1570 to 1971. No rain.
You just think how many generations there can't even describe water. Rain. Yeah, I always think growing up in Australia, I think for the first few decades of my life, I could count on one hand the amount of years that there wasn't a drought. We still saw some rain, just not a lot of it. But I couldn't imagine 400 years. I don't even think I can compute it properly.
Yeah, it's kind of like outside of my understanding. I can't really conceive of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely not. You come across as someone who wants to be educated about the places you're in. Did you find you were doing a lot of that beforehand as well? Or you wanted to arrive at an area sort of having an idea of what to expect there? Did you find that? Or was it more a case of, I guess there would be places, sorry, to be fair, there would be places where that would be more accessible, obviously. There's going to be places you arrive at where you couldn't know anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. There's always more and more to learn. I mean, it's basically just open up your mind and pour in all this just incredible information about cultures and histories and animals and landscapes, and there was so much to engage with. So there's always new things to learn. And I think one of the things you have when you're cycle touring is that there is often standard things which are available to tourists going through a particular region, which can sometimes be quite expensive and stuff like that. But I think the thing which a lot of cycle tourists say, which I would agree with, is that you have so much stimulation during the day. I think like with all your senses, you're entirely stimulated. I don't know if you feel this way, but you kind of, if you get to the place where there's this big tourist thing, you often don't really feel the need to go and see that, because you're like, I've just had so much go through my eyes in this day that I don't feel I need much more. But I would often go to museums if there was one, or ruins if there were some, and spend some time there, because there's always more things to learn. And being in touch with those ancient cultures, particularly, I think is quite significant in the modern world, which loses track a little bit with our history and goes hyper in the direction of new things and changes. There's a lot of things which those cultures knew, which would help us now, I think.
I can't even begin to think about that, though. Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes there's also that yearning for familiarity. I don't know if there's a word for it. Maybe you do, but when you watch, say, a TV show or a movie and it shows some town or some place where you've been before, and so it's like, oh, wow. Or you read a book and it talks about a village or a city that you've travelled to or you're from. And so it seems to I guess it triggers memories, so it garners more interest from you.
Yeah.
Do you find now, having done this big trip that you've thought about for so many years, having returned home, and I realise you've only been home a matter of days, but do you find, have you got this yearning within you to go and seek out stuff about where you've been to learn more about what you've just done?
I think it's easier to have a connection with a place if you have actually been there, isn't it? So I'm just incredibly fortunate to now have pretty much, not endless, but like a very significant list of places which I could go back and investigate, or, you know, even people from a particular town like this person came from. You know, this town, people have biographies. You think about how they grew up and how they were affected by the landscape they grew up in, and you'd experience that yourself. So you feel like you could understand those people a little bit better. Yeah, there's so many leads to go into to learn more about the world based on the places that I've visited.
What about low moments on the trip then? Because we talk about moments of jaw-dropping beauty and things, but I always say it's not always blue skies and sunshine. It is real life. So you go through the highs and lows as you would. You're a human after all. Were there points in the trip where you considered maybe not continuing on? You mentioned you had a month pause because you were sort of a bit sick of it. Were you sick of it enough at that point to think about, you know what, I don't need to get to my end goal here?
No, that wasn't. It was so deeply ingrained that I wanted to go to that point it was always about working for an amount of time before continuing on. But I think maybe the most challenging thing is removing yourself from your family environment for such an extended period of time and knowing that you potentially won't be there for difficulties that can arise. And we had some difficult things in my family whilst I was away. And there was sort of that question of whether it would be right to return and end the trip and come back early. But I think you just have to have good communication with your family, and kind of ultimately we decided that it was so important to me and it was going to make such an impact on my life that some things have to get put on the back burner until you return to your country. And it would have given me so much and had been so important for so long for me to finish this so that I could get through it. But in a day-to-day sense, I mean, you kind of get used to what you're doing. 6 hours a day cycling up and down these huge mountains, and it's quite physically difficult. But the moment you get ill, you resolve those questions and you're sort of led in bed and you literally can't get up. You're like, what I'm doing every day is absolutely crazy for my body. Like, it's so absurd. But when you become accustomed to it and you're doing it every day, it's difficult, but you carry on doing it. But yeah, I'd say when you have those moments when you're ill in bed, which I think most cycle tourists have had at some point, because avoiding every germ across a continent when you're sleeping outside and you're eating different food, it's kind of impossible.
Water contamination and stuff like that as well. Yeah. There's a few dodgy stomachs that have churned through it in a tent, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess you also talk about, like, when you do something so physical for 5 to 6 hours, it's normal for you on this tour. It becomes normalized, but it's so abnormal in the context of what we would do day to day.
Completely abnormal, yeah.
Yeah. And I think people find it's a struggle for friends to relate to that, because it's not, unless they ride bikes for that long or have been up a particularly hard climb or experienced the benefits of slow travel. A lot of adults, especially in the Western world, know what the sensation of riding a bike feels like.
Yeah.
But travelling in that manner isn't something they can necessarily compute. And you could tell someone, I travelled 10 kilometres, I travelled 150 kilometres, or I travelled 5 kilometres an hour because of a 60-kilometre headwind.
Yeah.
But they don't really understand it as much. That's the difficult part too.
It's difficult approaching that open-ended question, which people go and you see them for the first time and they're like, how was your trip? And you're like, that's
how long do you have?
I don't know where I'm going to go with that. I think we and Jake decided that probably the best question to ask cycle tourists, if you want to get a good story, is probably just ask them, can you tell me about one day of your trip? Like, what one day did you find particularly interesting? So I think that's probably the best conversation start, because how was your trip is just like, no idea where to start.
I really like this. I may steal it for future interviews, and I'm going to flip it now back to you. Tell me about a day on your trip.
One day. I have to think about
that. There you go.
Good question.
It is, isn't it? See? This will help. This is practice now. Interview practice for hundreds of friends asking you this for years to come.
We had, we both agreed, me and Jake, that of all of it was always going to be a little bit like this. But the first 5 days, we had a 6-day section before we got to the first official campsite. So we wild camped for 6 days. And we were doing that on the gravel road, the Carretera Austral, which is like the the road that Pinochet built to link up all of southern Chile. And obviously at that moment, we were our most wide-eyed that we had been, because it was like right at the beginning of the trip, we were just setting off on this, once in a lifetime journey. We decided to leave Patagonia to start in Patagonia in the autumn, which is actually really late to be doing it generally. I've heard that if you travel down there in the summer, you meet 25 cycle tourists a day. It's a very well-trodden path. We were just on the edge of the winter, and most people are already much further north. They're traveling from south to north. So it's fairly deserted going through that area, but we got 5 days of just perfect blue skies. All of the trees were orange. There was this purple layer of trees that were turning below the whites of the peaks above, and then we just had total blue sky, total blue lakes. And we had one day where we got some food late in the day, cycled out of town. We were looking for a spot to set up in wild camp. We just found this open gate, and this gate was just hanging open. And I think that's an invitation as a cycle tour to just sneak in. We basically run on the principle that we're absolutely not going to leave anything behind. We're not going to damage anything. We might sneak into a place and then sneak out again before the morning. We went in, we just we're pushing our bikes down through this little foresty bit, and the forest cleared. And there's this open grassy patch just looking over this enormous lake all the way down as far as you could see both ways. And then the sky had clouds and it went totally pink. So the entire sky was pink. We set up our tents on the edge looking out of the lake. And then from the morning after that, we were up before dawn. Everything was frozen over. Everything, it looks all like velvety on your handlebars and on your tent. It was all like thinly crusted in ice. And then we just sat there as the sun came up. And the light down there in Patagonia, there's no light pollution. There's not any city for hundreds of miles. And the light there was just illuminating just everything inside, coming through all the leaves. Like there's leaves just turning this sort of like neon green as the sun came through. That day was just absolutely out of this world.
Oh, my passion, Jack, is photography. So your passion is history, maybe. Mine is photography. Yeah. And I'm just thinking of golden hour. Yeah. And blue hour in the evening as well, and just, the landscape there. What a day.
Yeah.
I love it.
I do think that's something, I didn't know you were into photography, but there must be different places where light has a different quality, right? Because in Patagonia, I think I was just taking pictures that they came out as just, they looked like professional photos. I don't have any skill with doing it. Like they were incredible photos without trying that hard.
I know certainly in France there's places where I'm fortunate to be close to in the Pyrenees, Pic du Midi, where there's a astronomy observatory there because there is no light pollution and it's just absolutely magic. And I've travelled to similar places near New Zealand as well, and it has that same feel about it. It's like, I don't think I could take a bad photo here. Yeah. The thing that I love about photos on tours is, much like your journals and writing, for me, they're a way to spark my memories as well. Yeah. I'll see something and I'm like, wow. And if you had a photo of that day, you could recall the whole day with so much detail.
Yeah.
I love that. And I imagine you've got so many photos from your trip as well.
Absurd amount of photos. Just using my phone as well. I tried to organise to get a good camera for this trip because I thought that was pretty important, but it ended up chasing me across continents and it never actually arrived to me. But first it went to the wrong house in England, and then it was guaranteed to arrive the day before I left at the other house I was at. Didn't arrive. And then it was guaranteed to arrive to Argentina to meet me on the way, and it didn't arrive. And then Argentina ended up keeping it in customs for 4 months without any update about where it was. And then they just sent it back to England. So actually, if anyone is listening, never send anything to Argentina that's of value, I think, because it will not get out of customs.
Oh, my goodness me. Oh, my heart feels sad about that camera. Yeah. Although what I will say is the quality of a phone camera these days is absurd. It is pretty good. So all was not lost there at all.
It was also kind of, it fits with bikepacking spirit to, I think, just pull out a lightweight phone and take pictures. Although I did like taking pictures, I really appreciated not having the most damageable thing to think about all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, my passion is photography. I know we've talked about your passion and teaching and history, but, we touched on earlier in the show, you are long distance running was something that you really energized yourself through. Yeah. You did take time during this trip to do some of those as well. You wore your running shoes out. I saw that.
Yeah, I had just running shoes and one pair of bike shoes. So running shoes have to double as dancing shoes as well when you go out. Or any sort of social, because you can't dance in cleats.
Tango in cleats would be interesting.
Yeah, I think it went great by the end. But that was basically just because running had become sort of the most important sport for me. I think it's the simplest. You can do it anywhere, and it's also like the best way to get to know a place generally. So I couldn't give up the opportunity to run in all these places as well. I mean, I find it quite strange flying to do races sometimes, just because, well, we talked about the sustainability aspect of it before, but like the opportunity, I was going to take one flight and be able to run in 6 different countries was just too good to miss. So I ended up running quite a lot. When I stopped in Peru, I did a race called the Andes race, which was 60K of mountain running. And they claim to be one of the biggest races in South America, on the South American circuit. Trail running is just kind of getting started a bit in South America. I mean, people have done it traditionally, but as a big industry, they're sort of ramping it up at the moment. But I arrived quite close to the date and I was trying to convince them to let me in, but the guy was like, you can't do it, there's no space, we're not going to let anyone else in. So I had to do it the day, I did it the day before. So when they'd set up the whole course, I just went out and did it the day before, and it took 12 hours to do it or something. But that was one of the most memorable things of the entire trip, doing that. And I did have, coming into the finish line town, probably about 12 hours before the actual race participants would be. Several people thought I was the first person coming in from the race, despite having arriving before the start time. Obviously, the people in the
all the glory.
Yeah, they'd been told that.
Did you let them believe that, or were you sheepish?
No, I was like, I'm not in the race. I'm just running. I'm not in the race. I didn't have a number on. Yeah, and then it's the classic way endurance sports work. Really, you just arrive to this little town, done 12 hours of mountain run. Your whole life has been for 12 hours has been intensely in that moment, and then there's no one at the finish line. You just sort of finish, and then you're like, okay.
It's so true. It's so true. It's the same in ultra cycling events as well. Yeah. It's sort of like the most low-key finish you'll ever have. If you've got a close family member or friend who might be at the finish line, but generally maybe the event host, but generally it's nothing.
Yeah.
I guess it takes you back to, you're not doing it for that. It's those internal moments. But yeah, it has always struck me. And it's interesting that trail running is like that as well. Really the only sort of trail running type of events that I know of, obviously the biggest one, probably Ultra Trail Mont Blanc.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's big fanfare. So that's not typical, I'm guessing then, Jack.
That does actually have the frills. I was going to say trail running tends to have no frills. No, but UTMB is probably, that sort of modern way of doing it is one which has quite a bit of celebration around it, which isn't a bad thing. But like the things that the events I've been used to doing, I was dreaming of thousands of adoring fans being on the Caribbean coast as I came down the last hill. But in the event, I came down and there was a bloke with a little portable fridge selling beers and water, and I was like, "Could I have a water and a beer, please? I'm going to treat myself." I was like, "I just cycled from Argentina." And he was like, "Nice, this beer's going to taste good." And I just went and sat on the old walls and looked at the Caribbean coast, and that was the end.
That's an awesome moment, though. I know that sounds really weird, but I got goosebumps when you told me that. That celebratory sort of, wow, look what I've done.
Yeah. Special moment.
And just sitting on the beach, did you just sit on the beach, watch the waves and take it all in?
On the wall, because it's a walled, the old historic city is a walled city. So I just sat on the old wall. It's a city that's drenched in history that I dreamt about for so long. And you just look out at the sea and you're like, that's actually the Caribbean Sea. I mean, I was mainly trying to remember that first day that I just described down in the icy Patagonia. And at that moment, it was like 30 degrees, you're dripping in sweat, and you're like, yeah, I cycled quite far.
Yeah, and you cycled through different seasons, through different terrain, through different weather, through different health, feeling fit and healthy to feeling lousy and unable to get out of your tent.
Yeah.
Meeting so many different people, experiencing so many different things along the way. There was a quote that I came across from you, Jack, and I think it was actually in your summary of your trip that you put up on Instagram. And it was, I had predicted this would be the trip of a lifetime, but I was wrong. It was much, much better than that. I don't even have words to add to that other than that's just, it's awesome. And, really is. It's just so awesome to think a goal that you've had in mind for so long went far over and above and beyond whatever you imagined it would be like.
Yeah, it's hard to describe. Well, I think that basically points out that it was impossible. It's impossible, and for somebody who's thinking about doing it, it's impossible to imagine how incredible an experience it will be. Even though I had dreamed about that specific trip, I couldn't actually imagine what it was going to be like, because it's beyond the experience of what you can get in a normal day to day, I guess.
Yeah, far out. And the thing is, you don't need to process what it's going to be like in a day or in a moment or in an hour or in a month or in a year. You take your time processing it and allow the memories to just flood back and the flashbacks to happen and the weirdest things to trigger a moment for you as well. I think that's great. I'm here thinking, like I said, you've got students in future classrooms that are going to take benefits from what you've done as well. You're already paying it forward to future generations.
Yeah.
We could be really poetic and say you're going to inspire someone, sir, tell me about South America, and then maybe you'll get the modern version of whatever an email is in 20 years' time telling you, hey, remember me? I did this because of you. Maybe.
No, I'll probably meet the same kid that asked me on the way out, and they'll be like, how was your little bike ride?
Yeah, wow. And then you go, well, I'll tell you about a day.
I'll tell you about a day.
All right, Jack, I need to wrap things up. I've had such an incredible time chatting with you here, and time flies whenever that happens, but I do appreciate we need to bring this to a close. I always finish with the same 3 questions now for all my guests. The first one, it's music related because we do now have a Seek Travel Ride podcast, which you can find on Spotify or Apple Music as well. And what I do is I like to ask my guests the same thing here. If you think about your trip, what song would you pick to be the soundtrack for it?
A song called Volver by Lágrimas de Sangre, which means tears of blood. It's a band from Barcelona. It's kind of like a rap song, and it's about if everything fails, you've always got a place to go back to. And I played it approximately 643 times on the trip, so it's pretty closely wet.
Oh, I'm definitely going to play it for the first time as soon as I get off this call. Wow. What does the word volver mean in Spanish?
To return, to go back. It works both ways because I was listening all this time and thinking, well, if everything fails, you always got time to go back. It talks about like old friendships and the places where you had a good time. It's basically talking about your hometown. But then I also played it as I was flying out for the last time from South America and thinking, well, I could always come back.
Of course. You can indeed. Wow. All right. I've got you down there. Volver. That's you. Okay. Last 2 questions. The first one, you have the choice one day and you can cycle forever uphill on a constant climb, or conversely, you can choose a different choice and cycle into a constant headwind. Which one are you going to choose?
I think the constant headwind means I'm at the end of the world, doesn't it? So at Patagonia, I haven't been there yet. I've done all the uphill climbing for what seemed like endless times. So let's go with the headwind. I'll give it a go. I think that one of the things with the headwind is, although it is a constant battle, struggling through it, the second that you finish or you get behind a wall and you get that calm quietness that envelops you, you can't get that any other way than having been in a headwind for a long time. So maybe I'd do it for that moment.
Wow, that is the most positive spin I've ever heard for headwinds, because I imagine traveling from south to north in Patagonia, you had your fair share of them as well.
Yeah.
But you are right. There is that thing with a really big headwind that you can't hear anything. You can't hear yourself think even. So just for that moment of calm. All right, a whole day uphill, the whole day into the wind for a moment of calm. I will say, Jack, you are in the privileged minority in Seek Travel Ride guests who choose headwinds. The overwhelming majority of people are choosing hills. So I love that you're the alternate. That's great. Okay, final question. This will be interesting given your experience on this trip. You're one day given a choice, and I realise it's small considering what you've done, but you are going to be cycling just for 4 hours. Or maybe we'll tailor this to your day. You're going to have a typical day on your trip, and you can choose to cycle this trip on your own or with other people. What would you choose to do?
With this current trip that I've done, I think before this trip I would have said alone, but given what I've just experienced, I would say with someone else, because that capacity to retell the story when you've been in a place which is particularly incredible and which is difficult to describe to other people, it's such a special thing to be able to share it. Even though I am an introvert and would happily do many hours on my own, I think ultimately if I had the choice, it would be with one other person.
Wow, awesome. And you know what I was actually thinking? You know how we were talking earlier about the best question to ask a cycle tourist about his trip is tell me a day about your trip. Yeah. What would be interesting, and maybe you've already done this, is if you were to ask that to Jake, what day would he tell you back? Yeah. It would be quite interesting.
We've done a few things already because he's actually gone went back home. And then he went to live in Brazil with his girlfriend. So we do just text each other or just send like one photo. I often send it without context. So like a picture, there was one I sent with every layer on. He's lying on a bed and he's got his feet on the radiator. He looks freezing. And he's like, where was that again? And then I didn't look at his message, but like 20 minutes later, he'd sent another message saying, I got it. Salinas Grandes in Argentina in June. But it just takes you a moment to process that. But we can do those little prompts.
Just as an anecdote, how awesome is that this is something you're going to have the ability to do each time as well?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely great. Well, Jack Greenwood, it has been an absolute pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to you share your experiences from this more than a once-in-a-lifetime type of trip. It has definitely been much, much more than that for you. Thank you so, so much for sharing your experiences here with Seek Travel Ride.
Thanks very much for having me.
I really enjoyed speaking with Jack there, hearing him recount his stories and experiences from taking this monumental trip up the continent of South America, Patagonia, all the way there to the sandy shores on Colombia. So much adventure packed in between. And I really felt how energized he was from taking that trip as well. It was really clear that his passion for teaching, his passion for history molded into his passion for slow travel, the ability to share so much of that trip with a close friend as well. And I know I said it a few times during the show, but I am certain there will be kids in future classrooms that Jack takes as a teacher that will take some more inspiration from his trip as well, and perhaps he'll be inspiring some future bicycle adventurers as well. I just want to take a shout out now to fans of the show, my super fans who keep getting in touch with me and telling me how much they are enjoying it. If you want to join the community of Seek Travel Ride fans, then check us out on the Facebook page. I have links in the show notes for that. And of course, make sure you're following us on your podcast player. That'll let you know when new episodes drop. If you'd like to get in touch with me, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can either send me a voicemail, you can find the link in the show notes, or send me an email. My email address is podcast@seektravelride.com. Get in touch, let me know what's on your mind, and tell me what you're enjoying the most about the show. Until the next episode, my name's Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.